Welcome, Joel. It is fantastic to have you. And I don't know if an hour is going to be enough because I have so many things I want to ask him. We're going to be taking questions. So those of you who are watching this live stream on the question box, please put your questions and my colleagues will pass them on to me. So Joel, I want to start off with, I hope most of the people know what CPJ does. If they don't, I can just quickly tell them Committee to Protect Journalists is international organization. It is a not-for-profit that lobbies. It does many things, including create some metrics, which we shall discuss, in order to make the lives of journalists easier, to protect their lives. And that is articulated in this piece that Joel, you wrote for The Hindu, and it's dated today. It's called Pandemic and a Free Press. The blurt is India must return to its democratic values to tackle the COVID-19 outbreak effectively. And I will just quote one short paragraph from this piece. You say at the heart of any democracy is an informed citizenry that is empowered to make decisions and hold its government accountable. That is why there is nothing more essential to a democracy than a free press. It is not merely the means through which citizens gather information. It is the vehicle through which ideas are debated, policies are formulated, and conflicts are resolved. Yet, India's press freedom record has seen a decline in recent years. For someone who holds a sensitive post like yours, I think those are the harshest words that could come out in a diplomatic way. But first, tell us, why is the COVID pandemic unique in compromising press freedoms? What does this do?
Well, first of all, let me say what an honor and a privilege it is for me to be here with you and to have the opportunity to discuss these essential issues. I think the Newslaundry has become a renowned and respected forum through which the media, the Indian media, but the global media is able to engage with these critical issues. So I'm so happy and delighted to be a part of this discussion.
And Teamwork Arts has a lot to do with making that voice louder with their amazing experience in putting this together. So Teamworks has a lot to do with it as well.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here. So I would say this: I've been in the press freedom defense business at CPJ for over 20 years. I started my career as a journalist in Latin America, but I've been doing this work, defending the rights of journalists around the world for more than 2 decades. And I've never seen a global crackdown like the one we are living through today. This is worse than what we saw in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, when this new framework emerged of suppressing press freedom in the name of fighting terrorism. That also produced a global crackdown. We saw another sort of global shift in the information landscape following the Arab Spring, when autocratic governments around the world understood that the power of information, that information in the hands of the people was a threat. And we also saw a global crackdown then, and a rise in the number of journalists in prison around the world, a rise in the level of violence. But this is unique because governments, particularly authoritarian governments, are opportunistic. They want to control and manage information. They're threatened by independent information. And so they look for strategies to justify repressive measures. But in this instance, there's a certain legitimacy because we know that disinformation and misinformation is a threat to public health in the context of a health emergency. And we also know that we're looking to, governments have to take some steps to manage and control movements and the way that the vectors through which diseases spread. And so we've seen just about every government around the world, democratic governments, authoritarian governments, exploit this, not to genuinely protect public health, but to assert greater power. And we've documented a range of press freedom violations in almost every country in the world, and these range from restrictions on the movement of journalists to new laws that criminalize fake news and disinformation. Of course, in India, the Modi government attempted to seek the approval of the Supreme Court to restrict the kinds of information to which the public would have access. So that is my framework through which I'm seeing this. I think this is we call it the COVID crackdown, and I think it's unprecedented in modern history.
So what you're saying is they're using this pandemic as an excuse to crack down. Now, you have in your piece in the Hindu, it says India must return to its democratic values to tackle the COVID-19 outbreak effectively. Now, when you say that, it suggests that there was a golden age for journalism in India, which is not now, or was there? Has it become better or worse? I mean, the COVID notwithstanding, and the COVID crackdown, as you call, notwithstanding, you've been in this space for a long time. Where are we headed? Are we better? Are we worse?
Well, let me talk a little bit about India, and let me talk also more broadly about how India is perceived as a global a democratic leader, and the rising threat from China and the narrative that it is promulgating. So, you know, India has had for a long time a sort of, we have in India representative who's obviously expert on the India media scene. I'm not, so I'm drawing on the research that our team has done. But India's has always had two medias. It's had a highly competitive and freer media concentrated in major cities, and it's had a highly vulnerable and compromised media in many provincial areas and tribal areas, for example, where the kind of reality that journalists live in that environment is extremely challenging. And we've documented fairly high levels of violence over many years. We've documented a failure on the part of Indian authorities to fully investigate and bring to justice those who perpetrate violence against the media, particularly in the provinces. But of course, we've seen also a number of very high-profile murders in India in more recent years. We see a kind of rhetoric from the government that it reminds me very much of the kind of rhetoric we hear from the president in the United States. That compromises and attacks and undermines the role of individual journalists and seeks to and suggests in one form or another that the role of the media is simply to communicate government policies to the public rather than challenge and hold the government accountable. So our research suggests that Indian journalists in a variety of contexts feel that the information space is closing, and we haven't even talked about the online environment. But let me talk about why this is so important in a global context, particularly in the not post-pandemic. We're certainly not there. In the midst of this global pandemic, which is the narrative that China has put forward, which is essentially this. So Chinese censorship in Wuhan and its efforts to control and manage information and censor information actually, according to most analysis, helped facilitate the outbreak in Wuhan because it hid the implications from the public and from government authorities who could have and should have taken action to control it sooner. However, once the pandemic was spreading in Wuhan and throughout other parts of China, the government of China, the Chinese Communist Party, was able to bring the full authority and power of the state to bear in ways that would certainly be impossible in a democracy in terms of restricting people's movements, restricting the flow of information, building infrastructure projects. It basically brought the full authority of the state to bear in fighting the pandemic. And then it spun this narrative through its own internal and global propaganda networks that system is the only system that can effectively confront a public health emergency, and that democratic countries such as India, Brazil, the United States, certainly in Europe, the democratic system is incompatible with the necessary framework that's needed to combat a public health emergency. And therefore, the Chinese system is better and more appropriate, particularly the way it manages and controls information. Not surprisingly, this narrative has resonated around the world with authoritarian governments and even with democratic governments to a certain extent, who are asserting that they need greater power and control over information in order to fight the pandemic. We're certainly seeing that in India. So my article, what I'm essentially suggesting is that countries which have a democratic tradition need to make an effective counter argument, and they need to make the case that being a democracy is not a liability. It is an asset in fighting a public health emergency, and they need to bring the full resources that are available in a democratic society to bear. And one of those resources is the ability of the citizens to debate ideas, to have a sort of competition of ideas that lead to better and more productive outcomes, and to challenge authorities when they feel they are not fulfilling their role. And that cannot happen without a free press. So in my view, restricting the work of journalists or compromising it or undermining it in the context of a public health emergency not only undermines democratic values, it's a kind of way of shooting yourself in the foot.
All right. Now, governments, and I like how you make the distinction between authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes. I think with time, there's an overlap there. And
sure, it's a continuum. It's a continuum.
Right. And we're seeing that in many parts of the world now. CPJ, has these, among others, I'm sure, has these metrics. One is the impunity index, one is the kill caps, and one is prison census. And I'll just explain to our viewers. The prison census actually tabulates how many journalists went to prison for doing their job. The impunity index is journalists who were killed or attacked, and there was no repercussion. There were no convictions or sentencing to those people. So the impunity with which you can attack journalists and get away with it. In fact, they can attack even today as we speak. And the kill caps is how many are killed. Now, on these three metrics, how are we doing around the world over time, at least in your time as CPJ? Is it getting better or is it getting worse?
The global environment for press freedom is unquestionably getting worse. I think the most important metric in that regard is the number of journalists in prison, which has been at historic highs over the last couple of years. And let me talk you through a little bit about the kind of the waves of repression, as I outlined earlier, the kind of framework that governments around the world use to suppress press freedom. So if you look at our data on journalists in prison around the world, there were something like 80 some odd journalists in prison in 2000, at the end of the year 2000. The prison census, it's a census. We pick one date in December and we do a global census around the world, how many journalists are in prison. So that year, I think, was around 81 or so. And this was following the post-Cold War period, when we saw an explosion of press freedom around the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a kind of rise in independent journalism throughout Europe and many other parts of the world that were sort of embroiled in Cold War struggles. So we saw an explosion of journalism, and that was the lowest point we've ever measured in terms of journalists in prison. The following year, at the end of 2001, following the 9/11 attacks in the United States, we saw a rise up to about 112 journalists. And then after that, we saw a steady upward trajectory as countries around the world adopted this anti-terror, anti-state framework to justify repression against the press. The biggest violator, the biggest sort of abuser of this tactic was Turkey, which in this period became the world's leading jailer of journalists and basically justified its repressive action by describing journalists who wrote critically, for example, about issues of Kurdish identity or Kurdish nationalism as terrorists. So that was the first wave of repression. And then the next wave of repression came following, as I mentioned, the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring, coupled with the color revolutions that happened in Europe, basically freaked out authoritarian countries around the world, governments. They basically recognized that independent information in the hands of citizens and mass movements, mass mobilization, street protests were a threat to their power. And so we saw a global crackdown, again, largely particularly online. And that went from China, went from Iran, which obviously had experienced a brief period of turmoil following the 2009 elections, the so-called Green Revolution. And we saw a sharp increase in repressive action there. And then, of course, in Egypt, following the Morsi government and the sort of counter movement that countered Morsi. So we saw a huge crackdown in Egypt, also predicated on this framework. And then the next wave came, I think, in the Trump era. It's not quite as dramatic, but we see countries around the world that have incorporated the fake news framework that President Trump has used in the United States. That's very opportunistic for them. They basically reclassified critical news as fake news, and we're seeing a sharp uptick in the number of journalists imprisoned around the world on quote unquote fake news charges. And now we're seeing a new wave with the pandemic. So if you look at we don't know what the data is going to show yet, but clearly, as I mentioned, we're seeing repressive action around the world. So that's the trajectory that you get from one key indicator, which is the number of journalists imprisoned around the world. And it suggests quite clearly that we're living through a moment of significant repression and anti-media control.
Okay, so before I come to what extent is technology responsible for this? Speaking of fake news, the government of India just recently, the Supreme Court said that the huge mass exodus of migrant labor happened because of fake news when COVID hit, and I was rather surprised at such a claim being made by our very own government. But now you have clearly, being an old school journalist, adapted to technology pretty quickly. You have some fantastic podcasts on Guardian. Podcast is a relatively new format to consume news and reports, especially long form ones. While, during the intro, and I think the CPJ itself says how they can use technology and big tech to make journalists' voices louder. In fact, I have this book here by the founders of Google, The Digital Age, which was, I think, written about 10, 12 years ago. And there was an assumption that technology and the internet would make journalists' life easier. It would make their voices louder. It would make them be able to say more. However, by the trend that you're, discussing and telling us about, it appears that the digital world has not quite done that or lived up to the promise that we thought it had for freedoms and journalism. Why do you think that is? And is that true? Has the digital world compromised journalist safety more than the pre-digital world?
Well, I don't think there's an either or. I mean, and also when you talk about technology, it's very difficult to kind of imagine an alternative scenario in which that technology doesn't exist. I mean, what would our world be like if the telephone wasn't invented, or television or radio? Every technology that has an impact on the information sphere is disruptive, and it leads to changes, and the media adapts to those changes or fails to adapt. But I think what's been so particularly challenging about the sort of moment we're living through in terms of technology are a couple of things. One is the utopian framework that was at that's sort of part of the origin story of the internet. So the kind of internet pioneers believed that information would be impossible to control. It would set people free. It would completely undermine authoritarian systems. They had all these grand views of the power of information to liberate humanity, and that was hubris. That was absurd that we would believe that that could be the case. Now, some of those things obviously did happen. I mean, information, at least in the kind of system of the internet as a global system of shared information, was highly disruptive to authoritarian structures, and it did allow people to share information more easily across borders and within their own societies, and that was a boon. I mean, you certain things that we could do today that we take for granted, like I could read the Indian media from my living room. I couldn't do that before the internet. That's a huge shift in the information landscape. But of course, that same technology also completely disrupted and undermined the media as an industry. And a lot of people like to complain about how powerful the media is and what a powerful industry, media, how powerful media houses and how they disrupt information, distort it, and don't represent the broad segments of society, and all of that is true. But you also have to recognize that powerful media houses that are financially secure, if they're used that power effectively, may be in a better position to confront state power. And we miss that sometimes. When state power turns against the media, we don't have powerful institutions within the media itself to defend the rights of journalists. That is something we're missing in this fight. Of course, journalism jobs have been disrupted by the collapse in classified advertising, by news organizations pulling back reducing the number of journalists, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third thing that we've seen is the way that states and other malicious actors have entered the information space and co-opted it, and understood that the kind of democratization of the information space can be exploited by acting nimbly in a sort of less hierarchical way. So they can create troll armies. They can carry out very inexpensive information operations, terror and criminal groups, for example, the Mexican drug cartels or the Islamic State, can develop their own information and communication technologies, their own media, if you will, and use them not to inform people, but to terrorize them. So we're living in a very complex media environment. Then you overlay, of course, the information needs that are apparent during a pandemic, including access to timely, accurate, reliable information, and you put it into this sort of cauldron of sort of uncontrolled information, and you understand the challenges. I think the biggest problem when we think about all this is, one, you can't turn the clock back. That's not going to happen. We need to come up with a solution. And the issue is so complex that it defies any sort of easy solution. We're going to have to attack this from multiple directions, and we're going to need a level of international cooperation which is frankly unprecedented and difficult to achieve.
Right. Before I ask my next question, in case we have about 20 minutes from the question answer, so if any of our viewers have questions, you can leave them on the question box, and my colleague will pass them on to me, and I can ask those questions. So do leave your questions in the question box. Now, one would assume at one point there would be a certain agreement among journalists. There would be some sort of a consensus that we need to speak up for the rights of journalists, for freedom of speech, for the safety of journalists. Now, the polarization of news platforms and news professionals in general is a phenomena one has seen in other parts of the world. I haven't seen it to the extent that it is here now. And I don't know much about other parts of the world. Maybe you can tell us. I think it is worse here than it's been anywhere else. One sees, for someone like CPJ, a job would be made a lot easier when the local media of any country where you are, working, has a consensus that, yes, we share the same value system. We want to protect the same freedoms. we want to work towards the same ends or similar ends at least.
Mm-hmm.
Here, what's happening is that while there is an attack on one news platform, there'll be other news platforms. Not only will they not keep quiet, I can understand you don't keep quiet out of fear, but they will actually celebrate it. That completely muddies the water. And then depending
Yeah.
on who you speak up for, the other faction will say, they are not interested in the values of journalism, they are partisan. Are you having that problem in different parts of the world? And why do you think that is happening? And where will that lead journalists in general and an organization like CPJ, who's supposed to kind of speak up for all across the spectrum?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're seeing that problem everywhere, and we're also seeing, frankly, something of a generational gap. So it's a problem among the media, it's a problem among societies, which are increasingly polarized, and it's also a generational divide between the way one generation understands the issue of free expression and media freedom, and the younger generation understand it. And I could get to that in a moment. But journalism, when it's healthy, is a competitive, it's a competitive field. There should be a diversity of views, and there should be competition, and there should be disagreement expressed through the media. That's all healthy and good. The unifying principle should be that everyone has the right to express their ideas, to report the news through the media, and that journalists stand together on that single principle. And sometimes, the kind of origins of CPJ is, it can be a sort of, and sometimes I wonder if this is something that's missing in India. So a media outlet might not support another media outlet when their journalists are under attack, but they'll support CPJ. And so we can sort of serve as a kind of unifying organization that expresses broad principles, but is not a competitor, and so is beyond the kind of the scope of that kind of competitive pressure. But no, I'm seeing everywhere that it's harder to build a consensus around that idea, which is enshrined in constitutions and international law, that everyone has the right to seek and receive information through any media, and regardless of frontiers, because part of that framework is defending the speech that you disagree with, right? And it also can be defending speech that might even be harmful, right? If people have the right to express ideas that we believe are harmful, we defend their right to do it, even if we disagree virulently with the ideas expressed. And that's kind of, I think, the framework that most journalists operate within. But I see a lot of younger people, particularly, who have really experienced very directly the harmful effects of unfettered speech. They've been bullied online, they've been attacked, they've been harassed, they've been humiliated, they've seen, the negative consequences of a kind of unfettered speech that troubles them. They don't want their own speech curtailed, and they certainly don't necessarily want the speech of marginalized groups that are using these technologies to advocate for their rights. But they also live in a world in which they experience the harmful effects of speech, this online world. And so they don't automatically identify with these principles. And so that's another struggle that we're grappling with, is how do we bring the media together when it's so polarized and divided? How do we bring societies together? And I think that there's no question that technology and the kinds of information bubbles that people create and the communities that they create online amplify difference. So how do we bridge that gap, and how do we bridge the generational gap? I mean, I don't have easy answers to these questions other than to say, we have a lot of work ahead of us.
But so what I'm getting is that you do acknowledge that one needs to relook and rethink these principles that were fairly simpler to take a position on the freedoms, what you spoke about, even if it's harmful. Now, in the current, day and age, there is certain speech that is harmful. For example, a slogan that is "Desh ke gaddaron ko goli maro salon ko," like the traitors of the country, shoot them all, which is a slogan which you can say, I'm not telling someone to actually go out and shoot, but it can have real life consequences, and I believe it has. Similarly, the Pizzagate in the US, while it is false, and so what is harmful is now can have very serious consequences on the ground.
Correct.
And one is seeing that in various parts of the world. One has seen that in Myanmar. So do you think it's time to relook and rethink in protecting speech, even if it's harmful, because now the harm is significant and serious?
Well, I think that the problem is as soon as you do that, I mean, the impulse is completely understandable. But, if you go through the exercise of trying to figure out who's going to determine what kind of speech is harmful and who you trust to grant the authority to make that distinction and then restrict it, that's a kind of dancing on the head of a pin argument that is never resolved. And the only way to resolve it is to significantly compromise our fundamental rights and to empower companies or authorities that are not necessarily committed to acting in our interest. So there's no simple solution. I mean, I think that part of the problem is, and I was thinking about this before our call, and I'm going to tell I mean, I think part of the problem is that the companies, the social media companies, are dominating this debate, and they put forward a framework for the whole discussion, which is about content moderation. In other words, their ability to develop systems to manage and control information and restrict certain kinds of information and amplify others that are beneficial, that they'll somehow sort this problem out, and that that this will get sorted. I have so many problems with that. One is that the whole debate is dominated by the United States because the companies are based in the United States, so the regulatory authority is predominantly in the United States. The debate is happening in English among a certain kind of elite. I really think that basically the analogy, and they keep developing new algorithms and new systems and new measures to moderate speech. And the analogy I would make is, I remember one time I was visiting India and I had to get a visa. And you may not know this because you're Indian, but it is the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy that's required to get a visa in India is like,
this is our fourth edition of the Media Rumble, and had COVID not happened, you would be here. So yeah, I know what we have to go through to get
it's really hard. So anyway, I went to the Indian consulate in New York a bunch of years ago, and they were like, everything is now online. You can do the whole thing online. Well, that was sort of an improvement, but the problem was the entire bureaucracy had been put online, all the forms, all the things you had to do. So they had made the problem a little bit better, but they hadn't solved it. And that's what we're doing with the social media companies. We're basically buying into their argument that, the problem is content moderation, and we could do a better job of that. We're developing systems to do that, but we're not looking at the underlying challenge, which is simply that they have too much power, too much money, too much control. They are able to exploit our personal information as a business model. They are able to, they basically have monopolistic power. So it's very hard to resolve the kinds of questions. And I'm not just going to sit here and say, well, this is the obvious solution, because it's very complex and you have to attack it from different vectors. But I don't think that you can address this problem, or let me put it this way, rather than thinking about how do we restrict information more effectively, we're engaging to a certain extent with this problem on the terms of social media platforms and governments. And maybe we think about it in terms of how do we limit the ability and power of social media companies to amplify information that is socially harmful, because their business model is predicated on their ability to know the kind of information we want, to direct us to information that has a virality, and not necessarily to provide the most relevant and timely and accurate information that really is essential for people in order to exercise their democratic rights.
So in your activities and work around the world, do you find that big tech and social media companies who are under a lot of scrutiny around the world, with valid reasons, act differently in different countries based on their interests there? For example, I mean, I find that posts of President Trump or his son-in-law are restricted or blocked in the US because a false claim was made. Whereas in India, social media companies can't even take down, a post of a much lower down spokesperson, let alone the prime minister or the president's son-in-law. So if the conversation is happening in the American context, how is it that they have more spine there and in other parts they buckle much easier?
Well, I mean, look, each country it definitely happens in different ways. It plays out in different ways in different countries, and it depends on the political dynamic in that country. So in the U.S. now, I mean, that's why I'm saying the debate is so dominated by the U.S. So they're very worried about regulation in the United States. I mean, they're playing both sides of the street here. But if we have a new administration and the social media companies are perceived as not failing to stand up to President Trump and the kinds of misinformation and disinformation he's spreading online, then you could see a big push for media regulation for regulation or new restrictions on social media in the Congress. And they want to get ahead of that, because if they're regulated by in the United States, that could have a significant business impact. Whereas I think the dynamic in India is less straightforward. I mean, the power of the Modi government and the BJP and the relationship between Facebook and some of the political leaders has been well established, and the fear of the companies, if you will, of regulation in India is much less acute. And that will play out differently in a different country, where, in Europe, for example, where Europe has sought to sort of establish itself as a kind of regulatory hub for technology and social media, they have to tread a lot more carefully. But that's what I mean by I think the debate over the future of this technology, and particularly how it manages and controls information and the responsibilities that it has to its audience, is still dominated by the United States and to a lesser extent Europe, and that does not serve the needs of the billions of users all over the world.
Right. Do you spend much time on social media? Are you active on social media? What is your personal take on about CPJ?
Yeah, I mean, I have two teenage daughters, so I kind of vicariously experience what's the kind of latest thing on social media through them. But I've had, for a very long time, I've had a very you can't be in this world and live without social media. But I've had I like to think of it as a sort of disciplined approach to how I use social media. So, for example, I'm very active on Twitter, but I only post about press freedom. Never post about anything else. And I just define my identity on Twitter as, this is my area of expertise, and I have a lot to say about it, but I stay out of everything else. And that way, whatever I post, I'm informed about and knowledgeable about and willing to engage and defend my views the same way I would in public. So I don't like make casual offhand remarks, and I don't have a particular personality. The way I use Facebook is, I've sort of evolved as I've understood, just how, basically you're succumbing to their advertising model. If you're sharing all sorts of personal information on Facebook, you're empowering them. You're giving them data and information that they can use, not even necessarily to manipulate you, but to kind of understand more generally how human beings engage with information and build products that basically, kind of continue to draw people in and maybe even reflect back to them the views they already hold. So again, when I'm on Facebook, I never post family photos. I never post anything personal. I don't really engage. I just post articles that I write because I'm trying to get them out into the public anyway. So I'm not the most exciting and dynamic personality on Facebook. I know, or on social media generally, but I actually, use it to set. Oh, I should make one other point. I have an Instagram that's the opposite. It's very it's a Finsta. You're not gonna be able to find me. It's private. I have 30 friends and family, and that's it. And I post, occasional photos. So that's how I use social media.
Right. I'll start taking some questions, and if our viewers have any more questions, please put them on the question box that is next to where this is being streamed. This question says, government institutions with regulatory authority or political actors masquerading as vigilantes, which is the bigger threat to journalists? So is it government institutions, regulatory authority, or political actors who masquerade as vigilantes? What is a bigger threat to journalistic freedom, or I guess even just online narrative?
Well, it depends. It depends on the context. I mean, I think that there are one of the I talked about our imprisoned data. I didn't talk as much about the data we have on violence against journalists. And one of the things that's interesting is it's not always the case, but they don't generally correspond. In other words, if you have high levels of journalists in prison in a particular country, you often have low levels of violence. And if you have high levels of violence, then sometimes you have lower levels of state repression. And then there are some countries, for example, India, where you have both violence and state repression. China, for example, there's very little violence against journalists, but there's massive state repression. So it really depends very much on the particular circumstances, and it depends on whether you have strong state authorities who are trying to exercise power by abusing the law, or whether you have whether governments, for example, Colombia or Russia, where there was a sort of criminal organizations that were allied and supported by the government, protected by them, particularly by the judicial authorities, and they were the greatest threat to press freedom and journalists because they could act with impunity. They could use violence to suppress coverage, and they knew because of the relationships they had with the authorities that they could get away with it, and there would be no consequences.
All right, and sorry, and if I may just request our audience, I mean, no particular reason, but I'm just curious that when you put your questions down, if you could just put what you do, because I just like to know that what is the kind of audience that asks what kind of question. Are they all news professionals, or are they others? Now, this question actually mentions me. It says, Abhinandan has often mentioned that the ad-based revenue model, which relies on eyeballs, is a market failure. Has this market failure impacted press freedom? So, I mean, I'll just tell you briefly what I have said this on various platforms and seminars. I think, market failure as studied in economics, and there are various, market failures, whether it is merit goods, demerit goods. There is, insufficient information in the market, which they call the information asymmetry. There is externalities, and there are, various such examples of market failures. My thesis was that in India, the broadcast journalism, because it relies so heavily on eyeballs, it has to become a reality show. And in order to become a reality show, journalism gets compromised. For 2 hours, you just have people yelling at each other. You get your revenue from there. So there's no journalism being done. And then you build hate narratives. As long as you have one person to beat, put those person in jail, and their hashtags, send her to jail, send her to prison, and some such stuff. And if the purpose of a market is efficient resource allocation that improves the quality of the product for the consumer's benefit. The broadcast news industry is an example where the resources are not used optimally to enhance the quality of the product, which in this case is news and journalism, but it is actually bringing it down. So the market is having the opposite effect. That's if I
I mean, yeah, that makes complete sense. But if you looked at say the food market, right? The goal is to sell food. Well, people like junky food, So the market is sort of optimized to a certain extent to account for humans' taste. They like sweets, they like crisps and snacks, and there's those kinds of foods dominate the market, and I think there's a certain analogy there with information. I think you're absolutely right, um, that the market is not optimized for a healthy information diet, but it is doing a pretty good job of delivering uh, eyeballs by giving people, to a certain extent, what they want. And so the question is, how do we um, create a system that doesn't just meet the most base needs, but kind of recognizes that there's a kind of civic value in ensuring that people have access to the kind of information that allows them to actually exercise their rights as citizens. And we're living in such a free for all that it's whether you're talking about a broadcast, or whether you're talking about media organizations that primarily deliver their content online, or whether you're talking about social media and the way that individuals share content with their networks. All of that, there are elements in all of that pull us towards information that isn't necessarily the most essential for civic understanding.
but we're almost out of time. But I just quickly want to
Yeah,
pick a brain on, while in
yeah,
the food market and any other industry, the
yeah.
regulatory framework that is made to control the quality of the product, in which case being food or anything else, the government doesn't have a direct price to pay as to what, depending on the quality of that product. Like, if they make burgers healthier, it is not, with the exception of Michelle Obama asking everyone to eat healthy food and it becoming a political issue in the last election or the election before that, it doesn't have a direct impact on the government, whereas the quality of news has a direct impact. So the regulatory
Right,
framework around, for example, junk food caterers in the West are now required, or some of them have started putting the nutrient value, or have to take down the sugar content in their colas.
right,
Such things are happening, and you don't mind giving the government that control, because
right.
their control over the quality does not hit them. But if you give the government the control on the content of the product, in this case being news, there is
Then then
there's
you then
conflict.
you have Singapore.
Then you have a Singapore, exactly. So how would you solve this? How would
Oh,
the
I'm
head?
not going to be so um, hubristic as to suggest that I'm gonna solve this. I mean, I think that, or any one person is gonna. I think we have to. The thing that makes me optimistic, and there's a lot to be pessimistic about in this environment, is that I do think that the very sort of foundation and glue of human society, as it's evolved through history, is this need for information and an imperative to sort of tell stories that create community. That's what kind of makes us human. It's so basic and essential to who we are that we figure out ways to do that. And information allows us to kind of make decisions collectively. So I don't look at what's out there now and say, well, if we just did this, if we just did that, we could solve this problem. I recognize just how grave and significant it is. I see not just the threats to journalism all over the world, but the erosion of information. And so I think if you want to have an optimistic framework, you have to zoom up to 30,000 feet and kind of think about what makes us human, what are our basic needs, and from that, if you choose to, you can envision a world where at some point in the future, we do a much, much better job than we do today of delivering the kind of information that allows for informed and engaged societies and allows us to hold our leaders accountable, strengthens democracy, strengthens accountability, and strengthens the ability to fight global threats like this pandemic. But unfortunately, you have to have a long horizon, and you have to be able to kind of put in the work over many years to make that happen.
Thanks, Joel. I would have loved to go on, but as I'm informed, we have overshot by a few minutes, but it was worth
Okay.
every second of those few minutes. Thank you for being part of this. And I hope you and the Committee to Protect Journalists continue to do your stellar work, although I do hope going forward you have less and less work to do.
I would welcome that.
And for our viewers, I hope you value good journalism because, like Joel has written in his piece in The Hindu, which I recommend you read, the purpose of news and journalism is to inform the citizenry so that we can engage with governance and governments for better outcomes. And if that dialogue is not based on good, accurate, solid information, then that's the collapse of democracy because democracy assumes an informed citizenry. On that optimistic note, thank you, Suraj, and thank you, Joel, once again.